10 months after a confrontation on a flight in Atlanta, the former TSA agent at the center of it has been sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The case drew national attention after cell phone video went viral, viewed more than 38 million times. A profound abuse of authority. No one in any uniform gets...
Sir, stand up. Let's go. Now.
Why? What's this about?
Off the plane. Come with me.
I'm reaching for my credentials.
You keep your hands where I can see.
Just reaching, sir. Here.
You can read it. Hold on.
What do you got?
Take a look.
Oh.
The terminal at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport hummed with the controlled chaos of a Wednesday morning in early March. Thousands of travelers moving through the vast space like blood cells through arteries, each one focused on their own destination, their own timeline, their own small universe of concerns. The security checkpoint at Terminal D was particularly busy, a long serpentine line of passengers removing shoes and belts, placing laptops in gray bins, submitting to the indignities of modern air travel with the resigned patience of people who had long ago accepted that this was simply how things were. Elijah Cross stood in that line with the calm of a man who had waited in far more dangerous places. At 47 years old, he had spent the last 23 years serving in the shadows of American intelligence, first as a case officer with the CIA's Directorate of Operations, then as a specialist in what the agency euphemistically called high-risk human intelligence gathering. He had operated undercover in countries where discovery meant death, had recruited assets in some of the world's most hostile environments, had survived betrayals and ambushes, and the constant grinding pressure of a life lived in deception. He had retired from fieldwork 2 years ago, transitioning to a training role at the farm, the CIA's legendary facility in Virginia where new officers learned the tradecraft that might someday save their lives. It was a quieter existence than his previous decades of service, but no less important. The knowledge he carried, the skills he had accumulated, the lessons learned from operations that would never be acknowledged, all of it was being passed to the next generation of officers who would carry on the work. Today he was returning from a conference in San Diego, a gathering of intelligence professionals from across the Western Allies, where they shared insights and built relationships away from the formal structures of government. It had been productive but exhausting. 3 days of meetings and dinners, and the careful dance of professionals who spent their lives managing information. He was looking forward to getting home to his wife Sarah and their 14-year-old daughter Maya, to the normalcy of family dinners and weekend soccer games and all the ordinary pleasures that his extraordinary career had so often denied him. He was wearing civilian clothes, as he always did when traveling. Dark jeans, a blue Oxford shirt, a Tobias gray blazer that was comfortable for long flights. His carry-on bag contained nothing that would attract attention. A laptop with appropriately encrypted files, a few changes of clothes, a paperback novel he was halfway through. His credentials were in a secure pocket of his jacket, available if needed but not displayed. In his experience, the best way to move through the world unnoticed was to look exactly like everyone else. The line moved slowly, as airport security lines always did. Elijah occupied his mind by observing the people around him, an old habit that never quite went away. The harried mother with 2 young children. The businessman checking his phone every 30 seconds. The elderly couple holding hands as they shuffled forward. The young woman with headphones in, nodding to music only she could hear. All of them were stories he would never know. Lives that intersected with his for these few minutes before diverging forever. When he reached the document check podium, he handed his boarding pass and driver's license to the TSA officer, a tired-looking woman who barely glanced at his face before waving him through. So far, everything was proceeding normally. He placed his bag on the conveyor belt, removed his jacket and shoes and belt, put his laptop in a separate bin, and walked through the body scanner with his arms raised. The machine beeped, indicating something that required additional screening. This happened occasionally, usually because of the small metal plate in his left shoulder, a souvenir from an operation in Yemen that had gone wrong in ways he tried not to think about. "Sir, please step over here for additional screening." The voice belonged to a TSA officer who was approaching from the secondary inspection area. He was white, early 50s, with a thick build and a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of suspicion. His name tag read, Garrett, and something about the way he looked at Elijah immediately put Elijah on alert. It wasn't obvious, nothing that would stand out to a casual observer. But Elijah had spent 2 decades reading people, interpreting micro-expressions, sensing hostility before it manifested in action. And what he saw in Officer Garrett's eyes was something he had encountered many times before, though usually in countries far from home. Contempt, assumption, the particular look of a man who had already decided who Elijah was before exchanging a single word with him. "Of course," Elijah said, keeping his voice neutral. I have a metal plate in my shoulder from an old injury. That might be what triggered the alarm. We'll determine what triggered it, Garrett said, his tone dismissive. Follow me. He led Elijah to the secondary screening area, a space set apart from the main checkpoint by portable barriers. Other passengers glanced over as they passed, some curious, some relieved that they weren't the ones being pulled aside. Elijah maintained his composure, his expression pleasant and cooperative, giving no indication that every sense he possessed was now on high alert. Stand here, feet apart, arms out. Elijah complied, assuming the position he had seen thousands of travelers assume before him. Garrett began the pat-down with more force than necessary, his hands pressing hard into Elijah's shoulders, his sides, his legs. It was aggressive, designed to intimidate rather than to search. But Elijah had endured far worse in training and in the field. He simply waited, patient, and still, until the pat-down was complete. "What's your business in Dallas?" Garrett asked, his hands still on Elijah's body in a way that violated standard procedure. "I'm connecting through. Flying home to Virginia." "Virginia? What do you do in Virginia?" "I work for the federal government." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Federal government? Doing what?" "I'm a training instructor, government employees." It was technically true if massively understated. The farm-trained CIA officers, and Elijah, was indeed an instructor, but he had learned long ago that the full truth was rarely necessary or advisable. "Training instructor." Garrett repeated the words with obvious skepticism. "And what were you doing in San Diego?" "Attending a professional conference." "What kind of conference?" Elijah felt a small warning bell beginning to sound in his mind. These questions were going beyond normal security screening. They were probing, invasive, designed to find inconsistencies rather than to verify. "Identity." "A conference related to my work." "Is there a problem, officer?" "The problem is you're not answering my questions directly. The problem is you've got a suspicious travel pattern. The problem is you fit the profile of someone we need to look at more closely." There it was. The profile. Elijah had encountered this particular euphemism before, knew exactly what it meant. He was a black man traveling alone, well-dressed, carrying himself with a confidence that some people found threatening. That was his profile. That was what made him suspicious. "I'm happy to answer any questions you have," Elijah said, his voice still calm. "I have nothing to hide. And if you check your computer system, you'll find that my file is flagged with special protocols due to my government position. I don't need a computer to tell me when something doesn't smell right." Garrett stepped closer, his face inches from Elijah's. "I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know a story when I hear one. Federal government training instructor. Right. You know what I think? I think you're running drugs or money or something else you don't want us to find. I assure you that's not the case. Then you won't mind if we do a more thorough search. Step into the private screening room." Elijah felt the situation tilting toward something he didn't want. Private screening rooms were where rights disappeared, where cameras sometimes malfunctioned, where officers felt free to do things they wouldn't do in public view. "I'd prefer to be screened here in public where there are witnesses." Garrett's face reddened. "You don't get to prefer anything. You're in my checkpoint, subject to my authority. You either walk into that room willingly, or I call security and have you escorted there. Your choice." Elijah weighed his options. He could refuse and escalate the situation, which would lead to arrest and hours of detention while his identity was verified. He could comply and hope that whatever happened in the private room would stay within bounds. Or he could reveal his credentials now, which might defuse the situation, but would also compromise his cover status and require extensive reporting. He chose the middle path. "All right, I'll go to the private room, but I want it noted for the record that I requested public screening and was denied." "Noted," Garrett said with a smirk that suggested nothing would be noted anywhere. The private screening room was small and sterile, with white walls, fluorescent lighting, and a single metal table. A camera was mounted in one corner, its red light blinking, though Elijah had no way of knowing if it was actually recording. Garrett followed him in and closed the door, and for the first time, they were alone. "Take off your shirt." Elijah had expected this. It was humiliating, unnecessary, and almost certainly a violation of TSA protocols. But it wasn't worth fighting over. He unbuttoned his Oxford and removed it, revealing a torso that told the story of his career more eloquently than any words. Scars from bullets and blades, the marks of a life spent in violence, the physical testament to decades of service. Garrett's eyes swept over the scars, and for a moment something flickered in his expression. but it was quickly replaced by renewed hostility. Where'd you get all those? Gang fights? Prison? Combat? I served in the military and then in federal service. Everyone's got a story. Garrett gestured at Elijah's pants. Those two. Take them off. Elijah felt something cold settle in his stomach. Strip searches required specific justification under TSA guidelines. They were not supposed to be conducted by a single officer. They required documentation and supervisory approval. What Garrett was demanding was not a legitimate security procedure. It was assault. That requires a supervisor's approval and documented justification. I don't believe those requirements have been met. You questioning my authority? I'm questioning your adherence to your own agency's protocols. Garrett's hand shot out and grabbed Elijah by the throat, slamming him against the wall. The impact drove the air from Elijah's lungs, and for a moment, his training threatened to take over, the reflexes that had kept him alive in a dozen countries screaming at him to neutralize the threat. But he forced himself to remain passive, to absorb the assault without responding. "Listen to me, you piece of shit," Garrett hissed, his face contorted with rage. "I don't need protocols. I don't need approval. I am the authority here. You do what I say, or I will make your life a living hell. I will put you on every watch list. I will flag you for secondary screening every time you set foot in an airport. I will make sure you never fly again without getting the full treatment. Do you understand me?" Elijah met his eyes without blinking, drawing on every ounce of discipline he possessed. "I understand that you're committing assault on a federal employee. I understand that this interaction is likely being recorded. And I understand that you have no idea who you're dealing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with." Garrett's grip tightened. "Another thug who thinks he's special because he put on a uniform. Another criminal who thinks a government job washes away whatever he did before. I've seen 100 of you, 1,000, and I've put every single one in their place. Let me go, now. Or what?" The door burst open. Two figures in suits entered the room, moving with the controlled urgency of professionals responding to a crisis. Elijah recognized them immediately as federal air marshals, their credentials already visible in their hands. "TSA Officer Garrett, step away from that individual immediately." Garrett's grip loosened, his face showing confusion for the first time. "This is a security matter. I'm conducting an authorized screening. What you're conducting is assault on a federal officer with priority credentials. Step away now, or we will use force." The marshals moved to flank Garrett, their positioning professional and deliberate. One of them helped Elijah away from the wall, while the other confronted Garrett directly. "Officer Garrett, you are being relieved of duty pending investigation. You will surrender your badge and credentials to TSA security. You will not leave this airport without authorization. Do you understand?" Garrett's face had gone pale. "There's been a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job." This individual was being uncooperative. "We've been monitoring this interaction since you pulled him for secondary screening. Your conduct has been recorded and documented." The marshal turned to Elijah. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Elijah touched his throat, which was already beginning to bruise. "I'll live. What triggered your intervention?" "Your credentials flagged in our system when you checked in for your flight. We had officers monitoring your progress through security as a standard protective measure. When you were taken to the private room, we moved to observation positions. We witnessed the assault through the door's window." Elijah nodded, absorbing this information. The protocols existed precisely for situations like this, to protect intelligence officers who might be targeted or compromised during routine travel. He had never expected to benefit from them on American soil. What happens now? Officer Garrett will be arrested and charged with assault on a federal officer. The FBI will take jurisdiction due to the nature of your position. You'll need to give a statement, but we can do that at a location of your choosing. And him? Elijah looked at Garrett, who was now standing with his hands at his sides, his face a mask of dawning horror, as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. "That's up to the federal prosecutor. But given what we witnessed, given yours position, given the clear evidence of racial motivation in his conduct, I would expect significant charges." Elijah retrieved his shirt and put it back on, his movements slow and deliberate. He was thinking about all the people who didn't have priority credentials, who weren't monitored by federal marshals, who faced officers like Garrett every day without any recourse or protection. He was thinking about his daughter Maya, who would someday travel alone, who would be subjected to the same assumptions and prejudices that had nearly gotten her father killed in an airport screening room. He was thinking about the work that still needed to be done. "I want to speak to the media," he said. The marshal looked surprised. "Sir, given your position, Public exposure could compromise. I'm a training instructor. My field days are behind me. And what happened here today needs to be known. Elijah looked at Garrett one final time. Too many people experience what I just experienced without anyone watching, without anyone intervening, without any consequences for the officers involved. That has to change. The marshal considered this for a moment, then nodded. I'll pass your request up the chain. But for now, let's get you out of here and somewhere you can decompress. They led Elijah out of the private screening room, past the checkpoint where other passengers were still removing their shoes and placing laptops in bins, past the departure gates where flights were boarding and departing, past all the ordinary activity of an airport that had just been the site of something extraordinary. Garrett was taken in the opposite direction, escorted by airport security toward a holding area where he would await the FBI agents already en route to take him into custody. The two men passed within feet of each other, their eyes meeting for a brief moment. Elijah saw fear in Garrett's face, the animal recognition of a predator who had suddenly become prey. But he also saw something else, something that would stay with Elijah long after this day was over. He saw no remorse, no understanding of why what he had done was wrong. Only fear of consequences, not comprehension of the harm he had caused. It was, Elijah reflected, the face of a particular kind of evil. Not the dramatic villainy of terrorist leaders or hostile intelligence services, but the banal cruelty of men who abused whatever power they were given, who saw certain categories of people as less than human, who committed small atrocities in small rooms where they thought no one was watching. It was the face of an enemy Elijah had fought his entire career without ever quite seeing clearly. And now that he had seen it, he knew that his work was far from over. The next several hours unfolded with the surreal quality of events that seemed too significant to be real. Elijah was taken to a private lounge in the airport, where he gave preliminary statements to FBI agents who treated him with a deference that suggested they understood exactly who they were dealing with. Sarah was notified and assured that he was safe. The agency was briefed and began its own assessment of security implications. And the media began to gather. Word had leaked, as word always did in situations like this. By the time Elijah emerged from the private lounge, reporters had assembled outside the security checkpoint, their cameras and microphones ready to capture whatever statement he was willing to give. TSA officials stood in uncomfortable clusters, their expressions suggesting they understood that a crisis of significant proportions was unfolding. Elijah had spent his career avoiding cameras, cultivating anonymity, disappearing into crowds. But today, he walked directly toward the media, his bruised throat visible above his collar, his posture straight despite the exhaustion that was beginning to set in. "My name is Elijah Cross," he began, his voice slightly hoarse but steady. "I'm a federal employee with 23 years of service to this country. This morning, I was pulled aside for additional screening at this airport. What happened next was not security. It was assault." He described the encounter in measured terms, leaving out classified details but capturing the essence of what had occurred. The aggressive questioning, the demand for a private screening, the strip search, the choking, the threats. He described it all with the precision of a trained intelligence officer delivering a debrief, each fact clearly stated, each violation documented. "What happened to me today happens to Black Americans every day," he continued. "In airports, at traffic stops, in routine encounters with law enforcement. The assumption that we are criminals, the disregard for our dignity, the casual violence inflicted by those who believe their authority places them above the law." He paused, gathering himself for what came next. "I survived today because of the protections afforded by my position. Federal marshals were monitoring my progress and intervened when the assault occurred. But most people don't have marshals watching over them. Most people who are brutalized by officers like the one who attacked me today have no witnesses, no recordings, no recourse. That has to change, and I intend to do everything in my power to change it." The questions came rapid fire. Reporters shouted over each other, cameras flashing, the controlled chaos of a major news event. Elijah answered what he could, declined what he couldn't, maintained his composure throughout. When it was over, when the cameras had finally stopped and the reporters had dispersed to file their stories, he found himself standing alone near the window, looking out at the planes taking off and landing, the endless flow of travel that continued regardless of what had happened in one small room. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Watching the news. I'm so proud of you. Come home safe." He smiled, despite everything, and began walking toward his gate. He still had a flight to catch, a family waiting for him, a life to return to. But he also had a new mission, one that would consume much of his remaining years, that would take him from congressional hearings to community centers to training academies across the country. One that would transform him from a shadow warrior into a public advocate, using the skills he had developed in secret to fight a battle that needed to be waged in the open. The trial of Thomas Garrett began 7 months after the assault in a federal courthouse in Dallas that had become a focal point for national attention. The case had grown beyond a single incident of airport violence into a symbol of the broader crisis in American law enforcement, drawing activists and journalists and observers who saw in Elijah's story an opportunity to demand systemic change. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Video footage from the screening room's camera, which had indeed been recording, captured every moment of the assault. Testimony from the federal marshals who had witnessed the final moments corroborated Elijah's account. Documentation of Garrett's history revealed a pattern of complaints from minority travelers, complaints that had been consistently ignored by his supervisors. But the most damaging evidence came from Garrett's own words. During his FBI interrogation, unaware that his prior statements were being analyzed, he had made comments that revealed the depth of his prejudice. He had referred to Elijah using racial slurs. He had bragged about the number of black travelers he had put in their place over his career. He had expressed the belief that people like Elijah were getting above themselves and needed to be reminded of their proper status. The jury, a diverse group of 12 citizens from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, heard all of this evidence over the course of a 3-week trial. They heard Elijah's testimony delivered with the same measured precision he had shown in his initial press conference. They heard expert witnesses explain how Garrett's conduct violated every standard of professional behavior. They heard TSA officials distance themselves from Garrett's actions while awkwardly defending the systems that had allowed him to operate unchecked for 15 years. And then they deliberated. The verdict came after less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts, including assault on a federal officer, deprivation of rights, under color of law, and making false statements to investigators. Elijah sat in the gallery as the verdicts were read, Sarah's hand in his, their daughter Maya sitting on his other side. She was 15 now. Old enough to understand what had happened to her father, old enough to be angry about it, old enough to be proud of his response. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later. The prosecution asked for 15 years, citing the severity of the assault, the racial motivation, and the breach of public trust. The defense asked for leniency, arguing that Garrett had been shaped by a culture that encouraged aggressive behavior and that he was ultimately a product of systemic failures rather than individual malice. Judge Robert Martinez, a former federal prosecutor in his 70s, was not persuaded by the defense's arguments. "Mr. Garrett," he said from the bench, "you were entrusted with a position of authority at one of the most vulnerable points in American travel. Passengers at airport security have no choice but to submit to screening. They are required by law to follow instructions, to remove clothing, to allow their bodies and belongings to be searched. This submission is based on the expectation that TSA officers will conduct themselves professionally and lawfully." He paused, his gaze fixed on Garrett with an intensity that made the defendant shrink in his seat. "You betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. You assaulted an innocent man. You violated his dignity. You subjected him to treatment that would be considered torture in many contexts. And you did so not because of any legitimate security concern, but because of the color of his skin. The defense has argued that you are a product of a flawed system, that your supervisors failed to address complaints against you, that the culture of TSA encouraged aggressive behavior. There may be some truth to these claims. But you are not a child. You are not an automaton. You are a grown man who made choices. And those choices were evil." He shuffled the papers in front of him and delivered the sentence. "On the count of assault on a federal officer, I sentence you to 5 years in federal prison. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, I sentence you to 3 years, to be served consecutively. I am also imposing the maximum sentence on the false statements charge, which adds an additional year. You will serve a total of 9 years in federal custody, which this court is rounding to 8 years given time served. You are also ordered to pay restitution and are permanently barred from any position of public trust." 8 years. Garrett's face went blank as the number registered, the mathematical reality of time stretching out before him. The years of his life that would be spent in a cell because of what he had done in that screening room. Elijah watched him being led away, feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction but wasn't regret either. 8 years was a long time, but it wasn't enough, could never be enough, to address the harm that men like Garrett had inflicted on countless people over countless years. It was a symbol, a statement, a warning to others who might be tempted to abuse their authority. But symbols weren't sufficient. Statements didn't change systems. Warnings went unheeded by those who believed they would never be caught. After the sentencing, Elijah addressed the media one final time. He stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by Sarah and Maya, facing a forest of cameras and microphones. Today, justice was served in a single case. Thomas Garrett will spend 8 years in prison for what he did to me. I am grateful for that outcome. But I am not satisfied. I am not satisfied because what happened to me was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a disease that infects too many of our institutions. A disease of prejudice, of assumption, of the belief that certain people deserve less dignity, less respect, less humanity than others. I am not satisfied because while I stand here today with my family beside me, there are countless others who experienced similar treatment and received no justice, whose complaints were ignored, whose trauma was dismissed, whose humanity was denied. I am not satisfied, and I will not be satisfied until every person in this country, regardless of their skin color, can walk through an airport, drive down a street, or simply exist in public, without fear of being brutalized by those who are supposed to protect them. He looked directly into the cameras, his eyes carrying the weight of 23 years of service and a lifetime of navigating a world that saw his skin color before it saw his character. The fight continues. It must continue. And I will be part of it until my last breath. The years that followed transformed Elijah Cross from a shadowy intelligence operative into a public figure of considerable influence. He left the CIA entirely, concluding that his new mission was incompatible with the secrecy his former career required. He wrote a memoir that became a bestseller, telling his story from childhood on the south side of Chicago, through his decades in intelligence to the assault that changed everything. The book was remarkable not for its revelations of classified operations, which were carefully vetted by agency lawyers, but for its honest exploration of race in America. Elijah wrote about the code switching required to navigate white-dominated spaces, the constant calibration of tone and posture designed to appear non-threatening, the exhausting performance required of Black Americans who wanted to succeed in institutions that were not built for them. He wrote about encountering prejudice in the military, where his abilities were constantly questioned until they proved undeniable. He wrote about operating undercover in countries where being black carried its own set of assumptions and dangers. He wrote about coming home from missions that had saved American lives only to be followed in stores by security guards who saw his skin color and assumed he was a thief. And he wrote about the assault at DFW, about the moment when a lifetime of careful navigation had collapsed under the weight of one man's hatred, about the decision to stop accommodating and start fighting. The book sparked a national conversation about race in federal agencies. Congressional hearings were held, reports were commissioned. The TSA implemented new training programs and accountability measures, though whether these would prove effective remained to be seen. Elijah became a sought-after speaker, addressing audiences at universities and corporations and law enforcement academies. He was particularly interested in reaching the next generation of officers, people who might otherwise follow the same path as Thomas Garrett, hoping to intervene before their prejudices hardened into violence. His message was consistent. Bias was not just a personal failing but a systemic danger. Officers who saw certain categories of people as threats were not just morally wrong but operationally compromised. They missed real threats because they were distracted by imaginary ones. They alienated communities whose cooperation was essential for effective security. They undermined the legitimacy of the institutions they represented. It was a message that resonated with some and enraged others. Elijah received death,